The tragic demise of Princess Diana on that fateful Paris night shocked the entire globe, convincing the public that her narrative had reached a permanent conclusion. Yet, beneath the layer of collective grief and royal protocols, a silent legal machinery was already set in motion, carrying the weight of decisions she had meticulously finalized. Unknown to the world watching the televised tragedy, Diana had crafted a binding document designed to safeguard the destiny of her two young sons, ensuring their protection long after her presence faded. Before the chaotic legal and media storms could engulf her estate, she placed her entire earthly fortune under a specific, concentrated authority. This calculated choice, born out of deep personal vulnerability, continues to ripple through the upper echelons of the contemporary British monarchy today. The document itself was signed during a period when the foundations of her private universe were fracturing in slow motion, creating a poignant contrast between her legal foresight and emotional turmoil. She was navigating a deeply isolating existential space, no longer operating as a traditional wife within the royal household but not yet fully settled into her ultimate independent financial identity. During this highly fragile interregnum, the public scrutinized her every movement, making the quiet, uncharacteristic drafting of her last will and testament a remarkably private act. Just 12 months prior to this legal formulation, her father Earl Spencer passed away, leaving her an inheritance of £5 million. This massive influx of capital provided her with an essential layer of economic sovereignty, just as her marital breakdown became entirely irreversible. Consequently, this inherited Spencer wealth formed the literal backbone of her initial estate planning, reflecting a specific moment in her economic evolution rather than the massive divorce settlement she would later secure. There was no internal indication that she viewed this document as a temporary stopgap requiring urgent, immediate revisions as her life progressed. She moved forward under the universal human assumption that time was an abundant resource, unaware of the swiftly approaching horizon that would cut her journey short. When the ultimate legal dissolution of her marriage to the future King Charles III was executed, Diana received a transformative lump sum settlement valued near £17 million. This massive financial influx was accompanied by a substantial annual allowance, completely rewriting her position within the global socioeconomic hierarchy. For the very first time since her historic wedding gala, she exercised total autonomous control over significant capital completely divorced from institutional oversight. While she retained the prestigious title of Princess of Wales, she was stripped of her HRH style, signaling a profound shift in her systemic standing. She maintained her sprawling residential quarters within Kensington Palace, but the foundational architecture of her public and private identity had fundamentally mutated. Despite this radical influx of millions, she never initiated an update or a comprehensive rewrite of her existing will, leaving her legacy bound to an earlier chapter. The legal document remained firmly anchored in the immediate aftermath of her separation, structured around an asset reality that failed to reflect her ultimate wealth. When her life was abruptly extinguished at 36, her total estate had swelled to an amount exceeding £21 million through compounding factors. This immense valuation comprised the remaining components of her divorce settlement, diverse investment portfolios, cash balances, priceless historic jewelry, and her extensive designer wardrobes. Because she was no longer categorized as an officially working member of the royal family at the hour of her death, her estate missed out on privacy privileges. The traditional veil of total confidentiality that habitually shrouds the final testaments of the British monarchy was completely denied to her estate. As a direct consequence of this systemic technicality, the intimate details of her financial legacy entered the public domain for global analysis. Celebrated royal historians later evaluated the document as surprisingly conventional, noting a distinct lack of imaginative legal engineering or complex strategies. For an individual whose daily existence defied every standard convention, the actual text of her will read like a routine corporate contract. There were no hidden traps or complex clauses engineered to intentionally outmaneuver the palace apparatus she had famously battled for years. The true operational power of Diana's testament did not reside in creative legal prose, but rather in its highly disciplined protective structure. Rather than distributing her vast wealth immediately to her heirs, she established a rigid system governed by carefully selected executors and trustees. These designated individuals were granted complete authority to manage, invest, and control the entirety of her wealth until her children achieved maturity. For a significant chronological window following her passing, the absolute control of her global fortune rested exclusively with a few chosen people. Prince William and Prince Harry were explicitly designated as the ultimate beneficiaries of this multi-million-pound estate, yet they were merely young boys. Under the strict tenets of British property law, minors are legally barred from taking direct possession of large-scale financial inheritance. This meant that while millions of mourners focused on the heartbreaking sight of two young princes walking behind her coffin, a quiet reality occurred. Behind closed doors, corporate accountants were valuing assets, calculating complex tax liabilities, and making decisions that would alter the boys' futures. For several years, the vast wealth left behind by the deceased princess did not belong to her children in any practical framework. It existed exclusively within an invisible legal fortress overseen by a small cohort of adults who held her ultimate instructions. In everyday operational terms, this meant a tiny, insulated group dictated exactly how her money would be preserved, invested, and released. This concentrated pocket of temporary authority carried immense structural weight, yet very few individuals outside inner legal circles understood its true scope. These trustees possessed the unilateral power to determine distribution timelines, approve specific variations, and completely shape how the inheritance functioned. The will may have seemed entirely standard on paper, but its real-world implementation triggered a quiet battlefield over taxation and asset interpretation. Diana had drafted the document long before the full-scale war surrounding her public and private life was fully exposed to the public. She could not have foreseen how rapidly her time would end, leaving her fortune suspended in a gap between intent and outcome. In the final chapter of her life, Diana's private world had contracted significantly, even as her public celebrity reached unprecedented heights. The grand international galas, diplomatic tour, and humanitarian missions continued unabated, but her internal circle of trust had shrunk dramatically. The painful dissolution of her marriage and relentless exposure to the media landscape left her deeply suspicious of traditional palace advisors. Trust was no longer granted automatically to individuals wearing royal uniforms. It had to be earned through absolute, unwavering personal loyalty. One of the few figures who managed to secure this coveted position within her life was her dedicated butler, Paul Burrell. He served her with intimate proximity for years, witnessing highly private moments that the global public and royal family never saw. He observed her late-night tears, handled her highly sensitive handwritten correspondence, and listened to her frustrations regarding her profound systemic isolation. As Diana actively severed her connections with the formal royal infrastructure, Burrell remained firmly entrenched inside her immediate daily orbit. He did not belong to the British aristocracy, nor did he possess the credentials of a seasoned, high-ranking palace court official. Instead, he was a working-class confidant who had stood directly beside her during her most emotionally vulnerable moments of despair. Officially, the executors tasked with managing her massive legal estate were her mother, Frances Shand Kidd, her sister, and an advisor. Burrell's name was notably absent from the list of official executors legally empowered to dictate the distribution of her primary fortune. Yet, immediately following the tragedy in Paris, he positioned himself as the ultimate guardian of her most intimate private personal possessions. He later asserted that the princess had explicitly confided in him, requesting that he protect personal items from institutional interference. He claimed she feared that her highly private letters, photographs, and historical memorabilia would fall into the hands of palace authorities. When police investigators later discovered hundreds of these highly personal items inside Burrell's private residence, a major criminal investigation began. The former butler was formally charged with theft, facing public accusations of unlawfully removing property belonging directly to the Diana estate. This high-stakes legal case threatened to permanently destroy the carefully constructed narrative of selfless loyalty he had presented to the world. A criminal conviction would have marked an astonishing fall from grace for the man who branded himself as her rock. Then, just as a conviction seemed entirely plausible, the entire judicial proceeding took a cinematic twist that no one anticipated. During the high-profile trial, it emerged that Queen Elizabeth II suddenly recalled a private conversation she had held with Burrell. In that meeting, which occurred shortly after Diana's death, the safekeeping of the princess's personal effects had been briefly discussed. This unexpected royal recollection introduced a massive layer of legal doubt regarding whether the items were held with a tacit understanding. Consequently, the high-profile prosecution collapsed completely, and all criminal charges against the former butler were permanently dropped by the state. While Burrell walked out of the courtroom a legally free man, the long-term public damage to his reputation was completely irreversible. The entire salacious scandal permanently cemented the public perception that Diana had placed immense trust in figures outside the royal establishment. It reinforced the powerful cultural narrative that she was actively building a separate network of loyalty, entirely divorced from the monarchy. Furthermore, the public record revealed that Burrell received a direct cash sum of £50,000 from her official estate. When measured against a vast multi-million-pound fortune, this specific financial payout appeared relatively minor to outside observers and analysts. Yet, the deep cultural symbolism of this specific bequest carried immense weight within the broader context of the royal family. Diana had deliberately allocated a piece of her wealth to him, creating a tangible, permanent acknowledgement of his inner circle status. For a critical historical window following her death, every single asset she owned bypassed the traditional authority of the British Crown. Part 2. The entirety of her jewelry, designer clothing, investment portfolios, and highly sensitive personal diaries were processed under standard civil estate law. The monarchy did not absorb her wealth, nor did the institution possess any automatic legal right to claim her independent assets. This fundamental legal independence became incredibly significant when complex financial and tax questions began to surface among her designated executors. Because Diana's tragic death occurred within a single year of receiving her divorce settlement, a unique loophole in British law appeared. This specific legal framework technically allowed Prince Charles to launch a formal claim to reclaim the massive £17 million settlement sum. Had the future monarch chosen to exercise this specific option, the overall inheritance tax burden on the estate would have changed. Charles deliberately chose not to pursue this aggressive legal route, allowing the estate to face its tax obligations independently. The final financial result of this decision was stark, hitting the total value of the inheritance with immense fiscal force. After the relevant authorities extracted the inheritance taxes and administrative fees, nearly half of Diana's total wealth was effectively erased. By the time the complex legal dust finally settled, the remaining capital had been thoroughly reshaped by corporate boardroom decisions. Ultimately, the intense public controversy surrounding Paul Burrell exposed something far deeper than a mere courtroom drama or a dispute over objects. It illustrated how fiercely Princess Diana had guarded her internal world and how selectively she chose the people allowed inside it. Even in death, the sharp line she drew between the royal palace and her private loyalties remained completely visible. The day after she formally signed her last will and testament, Diana composed a highly private, separate document known as a Letter of Wishes. While this specific letter possessed absolutely no binding legal authority under British law, it offered a raw look into her emotions. She requested that 75% of her physical jewelry and personal effects be divided equally between William and Harry. She expressed a profound maternal hope that her sons' future wives would eventually wear these historic pieces throughout their lives. That specific emotional wish ultimately transformed into reality decades later, as both of her sons selected partners and entered marriage. Prince William famously proposed to Catherine Middleton using the iconic sapphire and diamond engagement ring that had once belonged to Diana. Over the years, the Princess of Wales has frequently worn Diana's favorite tiaras and diamond earrings during high-profile state occasions. Similarly, Prince Harry carefully designed Meghan Markle's engagement ring by incorporating two brilliant diamonds sourced directly from his mother's collection. However, the private letter of wishes contained another explicit maternal instruction that met a completely different, highly controversial fate. Diana had requested that the remaining 25% of her personal property be distributed among her 17 beloved godchildren. The executors of her estate ultimately exercised their legal right to completely ignore this specific emotional request from the deceased princess. Because the letter carried no formal legal weight, the godchildren never received the historic, deeply meaningful keepsake she had envisioned. Instead, they were allocated minor mementos consisting of small household items and porcelain figurines, leaving many families quietly disappointed. This clinical decision perfectly demonstrated the rigid, unyielding limits of Diana's personal influence once her life had reached its conclusion. Even an iconic, globally adored princess could not override the cold reality of formal estate law with mere sentimental instructions. The massive remaining portion of her wealth became what is legally classified as the residuary estate, forming the core inheritance. Under the original terms of her will, William and Harry were scheduled to inherit this principal sum at age 25. However, that specific timeline was completely upended when the executors successfully applied for a major legal variation known as an arrangement. This court-approved adjustment successfully delayed the prince's full, unrestricted access to the core capital until they reached 30. While they were permitted to receive managed income from the trust during their 20s, the foundational fortune remained securely locked away. By the time both young men finally celebrated their 30th birthdays, the core estate had grown significantly through strategic investment. Each prince ultimately received a massive payout hovering around £10 million, altering their personal financial capabilities overnight. While this significant delay was framed as a protective measure, it meant her final act of provision occurred under judicial supervision. Beyond the sheer magnitude of the money, Diana left behind highly symbolic physical objects that carried immense emotional weight for her children. Immediately following her passing, a young Prince William selected her classic Cartier tank watch, an item she wore constantly post-divorce. Prince Harry initially chose her famous sapphire engagement ring, though the brothers later made a private pact regarding its ultimate destiny. Harry selflessly surrendered the ring to William when his older brother finalized his plans to propose to Catherine. Diana's historic silk taffeta wedding gown, complete with its record-breaking train, was not immediately handed over to her two sons. Instead, the iconic garment remained under the strict physical stewardship of her brother, Charles Spencer, at the family ancestral estate. It was displayed at Althorp House and featured in global exhibitions to generate millions for the Princess of Wales Memorial Fund. Only when Prince Harry finally crossed the threshold of his 30th birthday did legal ownership of the gown transfer to the brothers. Many royal observers mistakenly assumed that William and Harry would also eventually inherit Althorp House, her childhood home. They did not inherit a single acre of the estate, as the property has belonged to the Spencer family line. The sprawling estate is strictly governed by the traditional laws of male primogeniture, which prioritize direct male dynastic heirs. When Charles Spencer eventually passes away, the entire historic estate will transfer to his son, Louis Spencer, completely bypassing Diana's children. Althorp represents far more than a grand country house. It spans thousands of hectares of prime British countryside and contains artwork. It also serves as the final resting place for the princess, whose grave is situated on a secluded, heavily guarded island. While the broader estate opens its gates to paying tourists during the summer months, her specific burial site remains completely private. This stark geographical and legal distinction highlights the complex division between her maternal legacy and her ancestral Spencer roots. William and Harry inherited their mother's liquid wealth and personal effects, but they remain entirely cut off from her childhood home. The unyielding laws of British bloodline inheritance completely separated these prominent royal heirs from the land where their mother grew up. As the two princes transitioned into adulthood, their respective financial realities began to diverge in a highly dramatic fashion. William's personal wealth expanded exponentially due to his ascension to the position of direct heir to the British throne. As the Prince of Wales, he assumed total operational control over the highly lucrative, revenue-generating empire known as the Duchy of Cornwall. This vast portfolio of land, real estate, and investments ensures his net worth far surpasses that of his younger brother. In sharp contrast, Prince Harry's independent wealth remained far more modest, making his direct inheritance from Diana absolutely vital. During a globally televised interview following his decision to step back from royal duties, Harry made a striking revelation. He explicitly stated that the millions left behind by his mother completely funded his family's transition to an independent life. Without that specific financial safety net, making such a radical break from the monarchy would have been impossible. While additional trust funds were established for Harry by the Queen Mother, Diana's estate was his primary bedrock. In this profound sense, Princess Diana's will functioned as something far more significant than a standard distribution of personal assets. It transformed into a literal financial shield, ensuring her children would never be entirely dependent on the financial structures of the palace. For a woman who spent years describing herself as trapped within a cold system, this was her final act of rebellion. She possessed no power to rewrite centuries of British constitutional tradition, nor could she alter the strict laws of succession. What she could do, and what she successfully achieved, was ensure her children possessed genuine personal leverage and choices. Her estate did not crown a new monarch, but it empowered two separate men to choose radically different destinies. This quiet legal shift continues to echo through the modern royal family, altering the dynamic between duty and personal freedom. Princess Diana's fortune was never merely an accumulation of cash, diamonds, and high-fashion items. It was a tool of empowerment. Ultimately, it raises a compelling question about her true intent and the complex legacy she left behind for the world. The structural independence of Diana's estate did more than just provide a financial cushion. It fundamentally altered the psychological dynamic between her sons and the institution of the monarchy. In a world where royal family members are often viewed as gilded dependents of the state, the princes held a rare form of autonomy. This autonomous financial reality allowed them to navigate their early military careers and public lives with a hidden sense of security. They knew that their livelihood was not entirely subject to the whims of parliamentary votes or the approval of senior palace officials. Diana had understood firsthand how financial dependence could be used as a tool of compliance within the royal apparatus, and she deliberately broke that chain. The ongoing management of the trust funds by her chosen trustees acted as a silent, protective buffer during their turbulent formative years. It provided a sense of continuity and maternal care that survived the intense media scrutiny surrounding their adolescence. By creating this insulated financial reality, she effectively guaranteed that their voices could never be completely silenced by institutional pressure. As the years progressed, the practical impact of the trustees' early investment strategies became increasingly apparent in the prince's philanthropic endeavors. The steady compounding of the residuary estate allowed the brothers to establish their own charitable foundations without relying entirely on traditional royal grants. This financial freedom enabled them to champion causes that were deeply personal to them, mirroring their mother's hands-on approach to humanitarian work. They were able to fund initiatives for mental health, landmine eradication, and disadvantaged youth with a high degree of administrative independence. The legacy of the will shifted from a simple inheritance story into an active catalyst for modernizing how royals interact with the public. However, this independence also introduced an element of unpredictability into the palace's long-term strategic planning, as the brothers held the means to chart their own courses. The institution could guide them, but it could no longer completely control them through the restriction of personal funds or resources. This subtle shift in the balance of power within the family became a defining characteristic of their adult lives. The long-term management of Diana's personal effects also created a unique cultural phenomenon that kept her memory alive across generations. The global exhibitions of her belongings, organized under the supervision of her family, served a dual purpose of honoring her and fundraising. These events allowed millions of people around the world to maintain a tangible connection to the late princess, reinforcing her status as a global icon. Yet the commercial aspect of these exhibitions occasionally sparked quiet tensions between the Spencer family and the royal household regarding the appropriate use of her image. The princes themselves had to balance their private grief with the public consumption of their mother's memory, a task made more complex by the legal timelines of the trust. When the ownership of these items finally transferred to William and Harry, it marked a deeply emotional milestone that signaled the end of public stewardship. They were finally able to bring her private possessions back into their personal spaces, away from the gaze of museum visitors. This transition of physical items also highlighted the profound differences in how each brother chose to integrate their mother's memory into their respective households. For William, residing within the traditional palace system, Diana's artifacts became a bridge connecting the past monarchy to its future destiny. He utilized her legacy to ground his family's public image in a sense of modern empathy and accessibility that she had pioneered. In contrast, Harry viewed these objects as symbols of survival and independence, reminders of a life lived bravely outside the conventional boundaries. The physical split of her personal property mirrored the geographical and ideological separation that would eventually define the two brothers' mature lives. The items she wore, the letters she wrote, and the objects she cherished became silent witnesses to two entirely different interpretations of duty. This divergence proved that while a legal document can distribute assets equally, it cannot dictate how those assets will shape human lives. Ultimately, the enduring legacy of Princess Diana's last will and testament lies in its quiet subversion of traditional royal power dynamics. By bypassing the crown and placing her trust in standard civil law, she ensured that her ultimate impact would be intensely personal rather than institutional. Her estate did not just survive the complex web of British tax laws and administrative changes, it thrived, fulfilling its purpose at the exact moments her sons needed it most. The document remains a powerful testament to a mother's foresight, drafted during a time of immense personal uncertainty, but executed with lasting precision. It serves as a reminder that even within an ancient system governed by rigid rules, individual choices can still alter the course of history. The financial shield she created allowed her sons the freedom to grow, to stumble, and to ultimately choose their own paths forward. Whether viewed as an act of defiance or a pure expression of maternal love, her final legal statement continues to shape the royal narrative.